Hello, I'm Paul Webb. I'm Professor of Politics in the Department of Politics at the University of Sussex. And I want to talk to you today about party systems in the United Kingdom. And I do mean party systems, plural, not just party system, even though we habitually talk about the British party system. Because actually, once you start to look at things, there are a multiplicity of different party systems across the United Kingdom at different levels of political jurisdiction, centrally, in terms of devolved administrations, and in local government as well. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about the variety of party systems in the devolved administrations before moving on to focus mainly on the evolution and change and indeed the stresses that currently the party system at Westminster is undergoing. But before I get into any of that, I want to start with a brief definitional module really in the lead up to that kind of analysis, by thinking about the question what a party system might be. What do we mean by a party system? Well, I have a preferred definition of this, which is like this. I would say a party system is a persisting pattern of competitive and or cooperative interactions displayed by a given set of political parties. A persisting pattern of competitive and or cooperative interactions displayed by a given set of parties. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's break that down a little bit. Firstly, when you think about the term system, you are always talking about a set of components or elements that interact with one another and affect each other in some kind of a way. This doesn't just have to be at the level of politics. We're not just talking about political systems. When you think about it, you find systems of different types in biology, in nature, in science, electronic systems, engineering systems, and so on and so forth. They often have the notion of some kind of sense of equilibrium or a recurring pattern of interactions as these different things affect each other. So in this case, clearly our components are political parties. So we're concerned with a particular set of political parties that interact with one another. Now, how do they interact? Well, broadly speaking, I think they can do it in two kinds of ways. There can be competitive interactions, which perhaps is the more obvious thing when we first look at the way parties, compete for office, power, votes, policy outcomes, and so on and so forth. But quite often also, they can cooperate with each other. Sometimes that's a little bit less obvious. It's a bit more behind closed doors, but it's still very significant. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment or two. But before I do, let me just focus first on one other aspect of this definition. I said that it was a persisting pattern of interactions between parties. Now, I don't mean to imply by that that there is no possibility of change, that a party system has to be immutably set in stone forever, as it were. But if you think about the essence of the idea of a system, there is this underlying sense of there being a type of equilibrium, some kind of a regularity, a recurrence of a pattern of the way that the elements interact with one another. If you don't get that, then you can't really even clearly talk about a system existing at all. And indeed, there are a few examples around the world of political systems where parties are so unstable, they come and go so regularly, with a lack of kind of consistency really, that political scholars even talk about party non-systems to try and sum up what's going in such places. Now that doesn't apply to the United Kingdom because we are used to the idea of certain parties clearly being there for the long term in our political environment and interacting with each other. So a persisting pattern of competitive and or cooperative interactions. What about some examples of competitive or cooperative interactions? Well, to understand this, I think it helps to think about the fact that these interactions between parties can occur in different arenas. And I would suggest thinking about the electoral arena, about the legislative arena, and about the executive arena. In terms of the electoral arena, competition between parties is pretty obvious. They compete for votes. They put candidates up against each other to try and win votes and to try and win positions in assemblies, in elected assemblies. But they don't always compete against each other. There are instances, including in the context of British politics as well, where sometimes parties will agree to cooperate with one another. Perhaps the best example I can think of in recent British political history would take us back to the 1980s, when the Social Democratic Party formed as a breakaway from the Labour Party and found itself competing in elections in very similar kind of ideological terrain with the Liberals, the old Liberal Party. Now eventually the SDP and the Liberals merged, as you probably know, with one another in the late 1980s to create today's Liberal Democrat Party. But before they did that, in the general elections of 1983 and 1987, they remained as two separate parties, but recognised that it would be suicidal for them to run candidates against each other, to stand against each other. So what they did was they carved up the 600 or more constituencies in mainland Britain between themselves, and they said in some constituencies we will just run a Liberal candidate, and in others we'll just run an SDP candidate. And they would run under the banner of the SDP Liberal Alliance. So that's a good example of cooperation between parties in the electoral arena. Then there's the legislative arena. And again, you have the regular adversarial knockabout between government and opposition in the House of Commons. So a very clear vision, really, of how parties oppose and compete with each other in terms of trying to get their policies implemented or not implemented, as the case may be. But often behind the scenes there is probably more cooperation going on between the parties than many folk might actually readily understand. Sometimes it's over minor details of bills before the House of Commons or motions before the House of Commons, and a little bit of negotiation, tit for tat going on between the parties will mean that they agree that the opposition will sometimes not oppose a government measure, or indeed the government might accept an opposition amendment to a bill. But there are even starker kind of arrangements than that. If we think about the present situation, Theresa May's government lacks an overall parliamentary majority. So what she did after the 2017 election was manage to negotiate an agreement with Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party. And it was a confidence and supply, so-called confidence and supply agreement, which means that the DUP will vote with the Conservatives in any vote of no confidence in the government, which could potentially bring Theresa May's government down, and indeed in finance bills connected with the budget, the passage of the budget. So in crucial areas, really, the government will be sustained. An even better example, in a way, takes us back to the 1970s, when Jim Callaghan's Labour government completely lost its majority in the House of Commons and negotiated a deal with David Steele's old Liberal Party at that time to get the support of the Liberals on a particular and sort of restricted programme of legislation that would be put before the Commons. It became known colloquially as the Lib Lab Pact. Lasted for about 18 months, but it didn't entail any formal coalition at the executive level. And that takes us to the third and final of one of the arenas that I mentioned, the executive arena. We're used to the pattern in terms of Westminster of single-party majorities since 1945 and single-party governments. But of course, sometimes governments lack majorities overall, and one of the options they have before them is to actually share power within the executive, to form a formal coalition government. And of course we have one recent very important example of that after the 2010 election, when David Cameron's Conservatives formed a coalition with Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats. The two of them formed an executive coalition together. So you can get cooperation as well as competition in these three arenas, and you can get that at the level of the central states politics, Westminster and Whitehall, or in any of the devolved administrations, or indeed in any of the 400 or more local government authorities which exist as well. So once you start to think about that, you can realise that probably the dynamics of party systems, what they look like, how much cooperation and competition there actually is, they can vary a lot. That's why I say actually there are multiple party systems in the UK, not just a single party system.